Hello. Say hi, Eve. Hi, Eve. What are we lecturing on? Can you say monarchs? Monarchs. Okay, so we're gonna continue on here on our lecture on the monarchs. No, don't touch anything. Say bye bye. Bye bye. Again? Well, Daddy's gonna finish his lecture now. All right, go. And go, go, go. All right, so we're gonna continue on. That was my baby. She wanted to be in one of the videos. So there you go. Hi. And we're going to continue on with our story of our absolute monarchs. Last time we had talked about the constitutional monarchies in England, and now we're going to talk about the absolute ones in France. All right, so bye bye. All right, so the constitutional monarchies in England, there was quite a few names last time, and they were all important, and we got to 1688. So what we're going to do now is talk about how absolutism develops in France, and then again, same idea, same two things, how absolutism develops in France, and what are the characteristics of absolutism. So let's go to our keywords here, and this is our first set of keywords. And you can see the word absolutism again, and we'll talk about in a second. And then all these other names in terms. Henry IV is from this Bourbon family. This is going to be the very important family we're going to talk about a lot over the next, before the midterm period. Edict Nantes, Louis XIII, Richelieu. Get ready for a lot of Roman numerals, right? Make sure you know your Roman numerals well. Those are going to come up quite a bit as we go through our story here. Um, so anyway, so this is kind of what we're going to be doing. We kind of first of all lay out what we kind of mean by absolutism. In a nutshell, absolutism is different than than constitutional monarchy, primarily because of the concept of there's nothing to check the power of the king. And there's a kind of another term we use that I'll kind of put up later, divine right. And what that term divine right basically means is that there's, your rulership power comes from God, right? And that gives you a sense of the pure nature of the absolute idea. This man named Bossuet is one of the early writers. He's not too important if you don't remember his name, but I do want to just read to you what he wrote in 1679. There isn't like a date, with the constitutional monarchy, it was 1688. England becomes a constitutional monarchy. With the French absolutism, it kind of just develops, right? There isn't a specific date. But in 1679, when France by then is pretty, much an absolute nation, this man named Bossuet, Bossuet, he begins to kind of outline a couple of the characteristics of absolutism. He says, in absolutism, there's no higher judgment than that of the king. He goes on to say, from this we conclude that he who refuses obedience to the king is not to refer to another judgment, but condemned to death without appeal as an enemy of peace in human society. So there is no other judgment higher than the king. If you do something wrong, the king could just kill you in a snap of a finger and you couldn't do anything about it. And one of my favorite things he says is the kings are not above the law, but they're not liable to the penalties of the law. So this is kind of what we'll get into in more detail later on, but I just want to give you a feel of, what absolutism is about. So in terms of how it develops, just like in England, we had a few monarchs, we had several monarchs. Here we have a few. And the first story of how France becomes an absolute system, I think really begins with Henry IV. Now, you got to be specific. This is Henry IV, the King of France, as opposed to Henry IV, the King of England, or the Henry IV, King of Germany. And so not only do you need the Roman numerals, you have to know which country they're from. So make sure you know this is obviously in France, everything we're talking about here. And he comes from a very important line called the Bourbon family line. So he is the first of his family. And when he comes into power in the 1500s, 1590, and again, you don't need to memorize exact dates, but circa late 1500s is fine. There's a problem in France, and it's the same problem that gripped much of Europe, which was that Protestant Reformation, which was the religions tearing each other apart. You had Catholics in France, and you also had this other group known as Huguenots. And these Huguenots, they were the Protestants in France. And there was a lot of fighting between the Huguenots and the Catholics, and it wasn't very good. It was pretty bloody, and Henry IV wanted it to stop. So what does Henry IV issue? He issues a very famous, very, very important edict called the Edict of Nantes, right? Edict of Nantes. And what is the Edict of Nantes? Well, you definitely want to know this. It's an edict of religious toleration for Huguenots. And from that point on, if you're a Huguenot in France, you could practice your religion. Henry IV says there'll be no more persecutions. Well, that's great. It keeps the Huguenots very happy. But more importantly, it brings stability to France. And as this brings stability to France, it makes Henry IV very popular. It makes his family line at this point popular. Boy, is that going to change later on because there's stability and there's order. And, he grants toleration for religion. And overall, this goes really well. And this is kind of the step towards absolutism because people like what he's doing. He does this without asking anyone. I think that's key as well. This is an edict. I, the king, am doing this. I'm not asking anybody's opinions or thoughts or parliament or this and that. I am going to issue this edict of Nantes. And so that in itself is important. So things initially are, all right, this is good, right? Things are beginning, right, towards absolutism. But that's not enough. You're going to need a couple other things to develop for the kings in France to rule in really what we call a pure absolute manner. And we're going to kind of explain what that pure absolute manner is as we go through our story here. So that's the first person you need to know. So obviously Henry IV, that's the first person. And again, you have your chart, remember, just like you had your chart for the constitutional monarchies, you have your chart that I asked you to print for the absolute monarchs. Use that chart as well. It's got all the names. Fill it in, get the information. It'll help you review. So eventually, 1610, Henry IV is dead, and he is going to be replaced by his son. The problem is when his son, Louis XIII, comes into power in 1610, there's a little bit of a problem. So make sure you get all these other words down by now, him and Richelieu. What's the problem with Louis XIII? Well, this is the problem with Louis XIII. He's 9 years old when he becomes the king of France, right? So he's very young. And obviously, being a child, he's not able to govern effectively. And so the other key term I gave you there was Richelieu. Who is Cardinal Richelieu? Well, Cardinal Richelieu is the regent, as we say, to Louis XIII. The regent meaning the advisor. He oversees things as Louis XIII is a child. And they're actually work together. Louis XIII is going to rule from 1610 to 1643, and Cardinal Richelieu is basically by his side until Cardinal Richelieu dies, which is like 1 year before Louis XIII. So they're kind of in this together. Even when Louis XIII becomes an adult, Cardinal Richelieu is right there helping him. Anyway, so what ends up happening at this point is you have the situation where he's young, and Richelieu does a really good job in what I call centralizing power in France. And what I mean by centralizing power is making sure that the only person who's going to have influence is the king. How does he do this? How does he centralize power on the road to absolutism? Well, one of the things he does is he makes sure that the taxes are not delegated to some parliament to collect, but rather he centralizes control of the taxation, right? So they're going to give you a few things here. And again, whenever I say there are a few things, get them down. So that's number one, just the taxation, more centralized control by the monarch as opposed to some parliament. So that's important. Another thing he does is, this is interesting, is Richelieu says to the Huguenots, you can practice your religion, but you're not allowed to have weapons. Now, just a little historical warning that anytime a ruler in any society says they want to take your weapons, worry. Never ends good. And you're going to see how this story goes around a little bit later. At the time, the Huguenots, well, we have our religious freedom. Why do we need our little weapons? Well, we won't push this. But that's something that happened as well. Not only that, he tells the nobles you can't have your weapons as well. And when I say nobles having weapons, it's a little more detailed here because the nobles actually had their own little militias, which is, you can't have your own army. You can't have two different standing armies. Obviously, that would be bad in a society. But he's doing this mainly because he's concerned about making sure that the only people who have control of the military is the monarch, that the Huguenots don't have weapons, that the nobles can't, rally a militia. This is all about centralizing authority and centralizing power to make sure no one can challenge the king, right? And so this is all, again, building us up to what will eventually be absolutism. So that's the story of Louis XIII. Louis XIII will eventually die in 1643. When he dies in 1643, he is going to be replaced by his son. And his son is, really going to be the key person in our story of absolutism. We'll spend more time on him. And that's, of course, going to be the very famous story of Louis XIV. So first of all, there's Richelieu. I didn't show you that image of Richelieu before. So there's Richelieu. He was the guy who helped Louis XIII. And then here are the key words to our next story, the story of Louis XIV. And how he comes into power, and then everything he's going to do. All of these points here that you're going to see from like l'état c'est moi all the way down, these are all going to be really good examples of how Louis XIV demonstrated pure absolutism. And I might give you some other details as well. So go ahead, jot down all these key words, right? So I'll give you a moment. Again, you can always pause, write them all down. So the first thing you need to know about Louis XIV is when he comes into power, he's only 5 years old. And do remember these dates. You don't need to memorize the dates, but notice how long he's going to be king for. It's actually a bit mind-blowing. But anyway, he's only 5 years old. So because he's so young, he has a regent as well. His regent is a man named Mazarin. So be careful not to mix this up. If I ask you on a quiz, who was the regent or who was the advisor for Louis XIII, it was Richelieu. Who was the regent to Louis XIV, it was Mazarin. Now remember, Louis XIV is a child when he comes into power. And at that point, there were people in France, this is kind of the last step to get us to pure absolutism. There were people in France who thought, I could see where this is going. Richelieu really centralized power. We have a new king. He's a child. If we don't want France to be an absolute monarchy, we need to break it now. And they led these what we call frondes or rebellions. And these rebellions were attempts to overthrow Louis XIV basically when he was a child. Who stops the rebellions? Mazarin. That's why Mazarin is important. He stops the rebellions. And by stopping the rebellions, that's the last hurdle. Once he stops the rebellions, there's nothing left to keep Louis XIV, when he becomes an adult, from ruling in a pure absolute manner. The other interesting point on this, and I've been lecturing on this for many, many years, and it was a few years ago I read another book on this, and it was a very important perspective that said that the frondes, which were intended to get rid of Louis, actually help Louis. And you go, how would they help Louis? Well, one thing people don't like in a society is unrest and disorder and chaos. And that's what those frondes were. And Louis stopped them, Mazarin, and then, was going to stop them. And what it makes people think is, well, I don't want chaos in a society. How do I avoid chaos? I have a strong, absolute ruler. Then I don't have to worry about going to the market or going to work and having, my house burnt down or, whatever it is happening. And so all of that is important in terms of helping absolutism develop. All right, so I'm going to move on to some slides here. As I do, make sure, again, you have all these other words. So now we get to this point. Mazarin dies. Louis is young. He's like 18, 19 years old, I believe. I don't remember exactly. But he's young, and then he is ready now to rule himself. So that's how absolutism comes about. So that's step one. Now, step two is what makes an absolute monarch an absolute monarch. In England, I told you to read that Bill of Rights of 1688. To understand what makes Louis XIV a pure absolute ruler, yes, there's things in your book, but I'm going to give you several examples. I'm going to give you like 6, 7 examples of what makes Louis XIV's rule absolute. So when you describe absolutism, you want to explain how it developed. We did that. Now we're going to explain what are its characteristics by looking at what Louis XIV does. So I hope that's clear. I'm going to give you several examples. We'll start with this. So this is how he dressed every day. This is part of being an absolute ruler, having this facade of a big, strong person, or in this case, this is big and strong. Well, this is this kind of ostentatious look, very grandiose, right? Way too much legs in this image, I think, but you get the idea. Everything is big. You want to show your strength. So that's one. It's also the kind of way he talked. You know, one of the things he said, one of the quotes there was, "Le état c'est moi." What does that translate to? It translates to, "I am the state." And that's what Louis XIV says. I am the state. I am the ruler. I am, I am everything. That's part of being an absolute ruler. So number one is the way he dressed. Number two is his words. Not just l'état c'est moi, but here is another thing he says. Listen to this. Up to this moment, I've been pleased to entrust the government of my affairs to the late cardinal. It is now time that I govern them myself. You, secretaries and ministers of state, will assist me with your counsels when I ask for them. I request and order you to seal no orders except by my command. I order you not to sign anything, not even a passport, without my command, to render account to me personally each day and to favor no one. All right, so that's the attitude, right? That's all part of absolutism. What else? Other things that show his absolute reign. One of the things Louis XIV would do is hold these ceremonies. I think another one of those words there was lever and coucher. What are those ceremonies? Well, those are ceremonies to watch the king get up in the morning and get ready. That's lever. It's the French word for to rise. Coucher is the French word to go to bed. And you'd watch them. It'd be a ceremony to watch him get ready. It's kind of this cult almost. And that's what you want to do as an absolute ruler. That's what makes you absolute, right? And as I go through this, try to imagine living in a nation where our presidents do these things, right? L'état c'est moi, or have these ceremonies to go and watch the president of the United States get married, get ready in the morning, go to sleep at night, and everybody's fawning by it. That's just not realistic, but that's what's happening. Another thing he's going to do is revoke the Edict of Nantes. He says no more religious toleration. And he basically says there's one king, one law, one faith. And he revokes the Edict of Nantes. What happens to the Huguenots? Convert or go to prison or die sometimes. Can the Huguenots fight back? Nope, they don't have any weapons, right? And so that's something Louis XIV does as well as part of absolutism. The Estates General, right? So the Estates General, that was one of the other terms there you have. And the Estates General, that's the parliament in France. And how often do they meet during the reign of Louis XIV? Never. They do not meet at all during the reign of Louis XIV. And how long does he reign for? About 70 years, if you look at the dates. And that's another example of his absolutism. So each of these things are an example of absolutism, right? The fact that you have him ruling for 70 years, right? We have presidents for 4 or 8 years. The fact that he revoked religious freedom in France, right? Our presidents wouldn't do that. The fact that he would not let Parliament meet. I mean, just try to imagine President of the United States saying, "All right, no more Congress, no more Senate. You guys cannot meet ever again while I'm alive." Right? It is ridiculous, but that's what was going on. It's also where he lived. And where did Louis XIV live? Well, in a little home we like to call Versailles. So I'm just going to run through a few images here and then actually read you some statistics. I'll read the statistics first, and then I'll show you a couple images of it. Because Versailles is this massive, I got a few images, but just to give you perspective of what this thing is, this is where Louis XIV lived. It's about, I've been there, it's about an hour train ride away from Paris. So it's not in Paris, it's outside of Paris. But just a few stats on it. There is 2,000 acres of Versailles, so it's 2,000 acres. There are 200,000 trees. There are 50 fountains. I'll show you an image of one. There's 52,000 square meters of floors, 2,100 windows, 700 bedrooms in Versailles, 67 staircases, 6,000 paintings, 1,500 drawings, 15,000 engravings, 2,100 sculptures, 5,000 items of furniture, and 150 variety of apple and peach trees if you're hungry. So that's all in Versailles, and this is where he is living. And let me show you a few pictures of it. This is one of the gardens in Versailles, right? And they're all massive and they're all beautiful. This is the very famous Hall of Mirrors in Versailles, one of the more famous buildings. If you know about the Treaty of Versailles for World War I, we'll talk about that later, right? It's the Hall of Mirrors. Here's another example of one of the fountains that he has. You could find a lot of other images of, Versailles. You could Google Earth Versailles, do that in class, and you can really see a lot of cool stuff there. But anyways, it's just massive, right? This massive, massive palace that he lived in. And it's all done to show his power. He encourages people to go there. He wants the nobles there because he wants the nobles to see, hey, this is how strong I am. This is what I could do. Is there anything else that shows this to be absolutism? Again, that's termed divine right, that I claim power to God. Oh, here's another one, another thing worth noting. His nickname was the Sun King because, what's stronger than the sun? So that's another example of his absolutism. And there's one more thing I'll show you, and you can see it on our map here. And it's his attempt to conquest and attempt to conquer land. And so this is something else he's going to do. Now, these areas you see colored here are really the only areas he conquers. If everything else is basically French territory. So he doesn't actually conquer a lot of land, but he makes the attempt because he wants to show everybody, hey, I'm big, I'm strong. So all of this is part of pure absolutism. All of these things I gave you are good examples. So if you're describing, remember, this is one of the big themes, if you're describing constitutional monarchy and then absolutism, don't just say, well, Louis XIV is an absolute ruler. Give examples. And everything we've just talked about the last several minutes are good examples that you would explain clearly in, for example, in an essay topic. What else? Well, this is all fine and dandy. The problem for Louis XIV is, and this is kind of crazy here, the way we're going to end the story of Louis XIV, and I got a couple of things to cover, is when he dies, right, when he finally dies in 17 roughly 14, he basically created this pure absolute rulership, but he also bankrupted France. And one of the ironies of Louis XIV is even though he is the absolute of absolute rulers, he is also one of the early reasons and causes of the French Revolution, where people get rid of the absolutism. And that's because, he left France a mess. They were basically bankrupt. Now, the last thing I want to read to you here is Louis XIV outlived his son, outlived his grandson. So before he dies, he calls his great-grandson to his side. And I want you to listen to what he tells his great-grandson, all right, who's going to be the next ruler. Listen to this. Soon you will be king of a great kingdom. I urge you not to forget your duty to God. Remember that you owe everything to him. Try to remain peace with your neighbors. I loved war too much. Do not follow me in that or in overspending. Take advice in everything. Try to find the best course and follow it. Lighten your people's burden as soon as possible and do what I have the misfortune not to do myself. That's the same Louis XIV who said, l'état c'est moi. And so what happens, he has kind of this deathbed conversion, so to speak, and he tells his great-grandson what is really good practical advice. The problem is his great-grandson, who's going to be the next emperor, or next king, Louis XV, is 5 years old. And he's not listening. He just wants to go out and play. And so that's the issue, and that's the problem, that the subsequent monarchs after Louis XIV are going to continue to behave in this pure absolute manner until eventually this blows up in the French Revolution, which we'll get to into another topic, another lecture. All right, so we've talked about constitutional monarchy. I gave you a bit on absolutism. We're not quite done in this lecture because, really briefly, I want to look at key words for Eastern absolute monarchs, right? And so the Eastern absolute monarchs, again, these are the monarchs that we had in Russia, Prussia, and Austria. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Basically, I just want you to understand what is the difference between absolutism and Eastern absolutism. There's more in your textbook on this. So in absolutism, there's nothing that checks the power of the king. In these Eastern absolute monarchs, again, they rule through divine right, and technically there's nothing that checks the power of the king. However, what you do have is a situation in Eastern Europe where you have those serfs. Remember those serfs? Serfs are still around there. Serfdom does not end. Serfdom ended, this is one of the reasons I started from the Middle Ages. Serfdom ended in Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, in Russia, for example, you still have serfs. And so the nobles are much stronger in these areas. And even though they don't go as far as to, do a constitutional monarchy, they can demand of the king a bit more rights and privileges. And the kings have to give a little bit, or they might have some problems. So just as a quick example, in Prussia, the nobles were called Junkers. I know it looks like Junkers, but it's pronounced Junkers. And these Junkers, these nobles in Prussia, were given special tax privileges inside of Prussia to rule and to govern. And not to rule and govern, but special tax privileges just so they could save money and live a more luxurious lifestyle. Louis XIV didn't do that in France. He's like, I'm not giving nobles anything. They're going to pay me. They're going to worship me, right? And so here in the East, they kind of bend a little bit. Austria, I'm not going to really say anything about them other than it's an Eastern absolute nation. And then Russia is interesting because one thing that you do have in Russia is the story, real brief story of Peter the First. So Peter the First, he was the Tsar of Russia, and you don't need to memorize dates, but just kind of notice 1689. He's basically Tsar of Russia. He's 17 years old when he becomes the Tsar. He's young. At the same time, Louis XIV is this pure absolute monarch in France. And so here's Peter the First, right? There's Peter the First. And Peter the First, he kind of had a little bit of Louis envy. He wanted to be like Louis. And so he'd actually get dressed up like a merchant, and like an average merchant. He would go over to France. He would see what people are dressing like there. He'd kind of go there, see what these are people behaving. Then he'd come back to Russia and tell everybody in Russia, I want you to dress like the people in France. I want you to behave like the people in France. Even when you look at architecture in Russia during the reign of Peter the First, this is a very famous museum in Russia. And if I were to ask you, hey, where is this museum from? It looks like it's right out of the Palace of Versailles, but it's a museum over in Russia. The Hermitage Museum, as it's called. And so you don't need to worry about the term and the name of the museum. But it's just to kind of show you this, pure absolutism that, that Peter envied. He wanted to be like that. Never really could for a very, strong way, but he wanted and he tried. So in the East, things are a little bit different. The monarchs in the East are going to bend a little bit. So as I said earlier, I'm not spending a lot of time on these areas of Russia, Prussia, and Austria. You're not really going to have a lot of material other than those few words I just gave you there you need to know. Later on in the semester, we will talk a lot more about places like Prussia, places like Austria, and definitely places like Russia. But for now, we're not too worried about that. All right, so what's next? So here's, again, our just map. And again, if you forgot where those Eastern European nations are, Prussia, Austria, Russia, and then, of course, England up here, France, right? Obviously, pretty obvious. You should know what all those are. So what's next? Well, here's where we are. We've now kind of covered the early part of the modern world. We talked about the Renaissance. We talked about the rise of these monarchs in the early 1700s. Before we talk about what happens with these monarchs and how a lot of heads are about to roll, figuratively and literally, what we're going to see is other events happening in Europe, because during the 16 and 1700s, there are two other major events gripping Europe other than the rise of these monarchs. One is the scientific revolution, so we're going to do a lecture on that. And the other is the Enlightenment period, where people really start to question these absolute monarchs, and we're going to do a lecture on that. So we've got a couple pretty big lectures still to cover before we kind of come back to the political thing. One of the things I love about History 111 is we really cover everything. We cover politics, we cover wars, we cover poetry, we cover relationships, we cover sports, we cover, science, we cover pretty much the whole gamut of stuff, and that's kind of a lot of fun. So we're going to kind of transition to some non-political people. And you're going to have a bunch more information of more names of more people, but related to the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. All right, so I hope that's clear. If you have any questions, let me know. And thank you, everyone. Have a good day.